Hey guys, tonight we dive deep into the odd and slightly spooky world of medieval mummies. Picture yourself walking through a dimly lit crypt, the air thick with the faint scent of ancient incense and dust, shadows flickering like restless spirits. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's kind of fun to see where all these late-night history explorers are chilling. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You brush your hand against cold stone walls, and somewhere nearby, centuries-old remains rest, perfectly preserved, or at least oddly intact, defying what you thought you knew about mummies. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive touching one of those, but hey, curiosity doesn't kill this cat yet. When we say mummy, the first image that pops up is usually a sun-baked Egyptian wrapped in linen, right? But medieval Europe and Asia had their own surprisingly vivid relationship with mummification, just way less glamorous and way more varied. The thing is, medieval mummification wasn't about tomb curses or golden death masks. It was often practical, religious, or even accidental. You're about to learn that medieval cultures had multiple ways to preserve bodies, from intentional embalming to accidental drying out in cold, dry crypts. Back in the medieval period, roughly the 5th to 15th centuries, you might think death meant one thing: decay and dust. But no, some bodies refused to obey the natural order. For example, in Italy, the Capuchin monks developed a preservation method where bodies were dehydrated in special catacombs, a process kind of like nature's own dehydrator. They'd remove internal organs, pack bodies in lime or salt, and hang them to dry. The result? These mummies look like shrunken versions of the person who died. Some still even have hair and skin intact. It's like a spooky medieval version of freeze-drying yourself for eternity. Historians still argue whether these techniques were purely practical to avoid disease or a spiritual ritual to keep the dead present for the living's remembrance. You see, the medieval mind loved blending the sacred and the scientific, even if science was a fledgling baby in diapers compared to today. The preservation was less about vanity and more about respect and connection to faith. Meanwhile, in parts of Asia, like Japan, the practice of sokushimbutsu, self-mummification by Buddhist monks, was a slow, deliberate process involving diet, meditation, and ritual death to achieve enlightenment. Imagine monks starving and dehydrating themselves over years to literally become their own mummies. Hardcore dedication or what?
In medieval Europe, mummified bodies were often found inside churches and crypts. Not just sealed tombs, but sometimes displayed openly or semi-openly for veneration. This practice had a lot to do with the belief that the physical body could hold holy power, or serve as a tangible link to the divine. You'll meet these bodies later, but keep this idea in mind. Medieval mummification wasn't just about decay control. It was deeply tied to faith, memory, and sometimes political power. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some medieval mummies were found with their skin painted or even clothed in their finest garments. Like body preservation had a side gig as medieval cosplay. These details offer clues about who they were and how their communities viewed death and legacy. So, get comfy. Tonight's story is less about curses and more about humans trying to wrestle with death's grip in weird, fascinating ways. Ways you might not expect, but definitely won't forget. Ready? Let's keep peeling back the layers. You've just stepped deeper into the shadowy corridors of medieval crypts, where mummies don't lurk in the dark corners like horror movie extras, but often reside in plain sight, nestled right beneath the very altars of churches. Yeah, it sounds like a gothic Instagram aesthetic, but these mummies were part of everyday sacred spaces, quietly reminding parishioners about mortality, and sometimes serving more practical purposes, like keeping the smell of decay out of the main worship areas. One of the most famous examples is the catacombs beneath the Capuchin monastery in Palermo, Sicily.
Historians still argue whether these preserved bodies were meant purely for contemplation on mortality, or if they served as holy relics themselves. Was their preservation a spiritual statement, or just an oddly practical way to deal with dead bodies? The truth might be somewhere in between. Beyond Sicily, other European churches house remarkable mummies. In Hallstatt, Austria, an old salt mine burial site produced dozens of naturally mummified bodies dating back to medieval times. The salty, cool conditions acted like a natural embalmer, drying out bodies and preserving them in eerie detail. These mummies weren't displayed for piety, but stored respectfully in crypts, sometimes even with intricate wooden coffins and personal belongings. Here's a quirky medieval tidbit. Some mummies in crypts were said to weep or bleed, reports that sparked fear and fascination. Of course, modern science often chalks these up to natural processes like moisture or bacteria, but back then, they fueled legends and reinforced the sacred aura of these preserved bodies. Churches also sometimes kept the mummified remains of saints or important local figures as relics, displayed in glass cases or shrines. These relics attracted pilgrims, boosted the church's prestige, and, let's be honest, brought in some serious medieval tourism cash. It's like having a celebrity corpse drawing the crowds. Yet, not every mummy was welcomed with open arms. Some preserved bodies were viewed as omens or reminders of past sins, especially if the person died violently or mysteriously. In some cases, these mummies were hidden away or buried quickly to avoid scandal or superstition. So, next time you visit an old church, remember, beneath your feet might rest a medieval mummy quietly holding court, blending faith, fear, and a little bit of showmanship. These sacred crypts were as much about storytelling and community memory as about the afterlife.
Now, imagine yourself wandering through a soggy, misty bog, somewhere in northern Europe. The air is thick with the earthy scent of moss and decay, but in the middle of all that wetness, you stumble on something wild. A body. Not just any body, but a so-called bog body. A remarkably preserved human corpse, skin leathery and dark, hair still intact, sometimes with the faintest trace of a beard or tattoos. These bog bodies are nature's unintentional mummies, preserved by the acidic, low-oxygen environment of peat bogs, rather than human hands. What makes bog bodies so fascinating, and a bit creepy, is their connection to medieval folklore and ritual. Some of these bodies date back to the Iron Age and medieval times, and historians still argue whether they were victims of ritual sacrifice, executions, or unfortunate accidents. In medieval Europe, bogs were often seen as liminal spaces between the living world and the mysterious underworld. That eerie atmosphere gave rise to legends of cursed waters and restless spirits, adding a supernatural layer to these preserved remains. One famous example is the Tollund man, found in Denmark, whose serene face seems to smile eerily even after thousands of years. While technically predating the medieval era, Tollund and his fellow bog bodies offer clues to how early medieval peoples might have understood death and sacrifice. Scholars debate if similar practices or beliefs lingered into the Middle Ages, fueling folk tales about drowned souls trapped in bogs, or witches lurking in the mist. Here's a fun medieval quirk. Bog bodies sometimes have strange injuries. Nooses around the neck, stab wounds, or slashes, sparking tales of ancient justice or supernatural punishment. Some medieval texts even mention bodies preserved by bog waters as signs of divine wrath or warnings to the living. Talk about getting ghosted by nature. The natural preservation is no accident. The peat's acidic, oxygen-poor environment acts like nature's embalmer, stopping bacteria from breaking down the flesh. Skin turns dark and leathery, almost like cured leather, and internal organs can remain intact. This preservation method contrasts sharply with deliberate embalming or drying in crypts, showing just how varied mummification could be. What's even weirder? Some medieval folks might have stumbled upon these bog bodies and believed they were supernatural beings or cursed souls. That would explain why bogs inspired so many dark legends, from will-o'-the-wisps to haunted marshes.
So, as you trudge through the mist, remember, these watery tombs aren't just gruesome oddities, but windows into medieval fears, rituals.
You're now stepping into a dimly lit medieval apothecary. Shelves crowded with jars, powders, and the odd preserved eyeball. Wait, scratch that last one. Or maybe not. Medieval doctors and healers had a strange fascination with mummies, or at least the substances derived from them, believing that the dead could help cure the living. It sounds bizarre, but yes, mummy medicine was a legit thing for centuries. The main ingredient? Mummia, powder made from ground-up mummy parts, especially the blackened, resinous flesh of Egyptian mummies. Though medieval Europeans sometimes used naturally preserved local bodies too. This magical dust was thought to cure everything from headaches to internal wounds. You could buy it at apothecaries, often packaged with a wink and a promise that the ancient secrets inside would fix you up. Historians still argue whether this was purely superstition or if any actual medicinal benefit existed. Spoiler, probably not. But it sure didn't stop the demand. The belief had roots in the idea of sympathetic magic, using a part of the dead to affect the living. Plus, Mummia's dark, tar-like appearance made it seem potent and mysterious, which helped sales. Here's a quirky fact. Even famous Renaissance figures like Nostradamus recommended mummy powder for healing. The practice lasted well into the 17th century, despite growing skepticism. Aside from powders, medieval doctors sometimes dissected mummies to study anatomy, though they had very limited understanding compared to today. They hoped preserved bodies could teach them about diseases or human structure, but religious taboos often made such studies tricky. But it wasn't all science. Some believed mummified bodies held spiritual power. In Italy, for example, certain mummies were revered as miraculous, believed to protect towns from plague or disaster simply by their preserved presence. Of course, there were plenty of skeptics and critics even back then, calling mummy medicine a scam or blasphemous. Yet, the allure of ancient wisdom was strong enough to keep it alive for centuries. So, next time you're feeling under the weather, just be glad your pharmacist isn't grinding up embalmed remains. Unless you're a medieval doctor, then hey, it's your daily grind. Up next, we unravel the actual embalming recipes that made all this possible. Recipes that were part science, part dark art, and 100% medieval weirdness.
You find yourself in a shadowy medieval workshop. The air thick with the scent of herbs, spices, and something faintly rotten, because embalming wasn't exactly a spa day. Medieval embalming was part science, part ritual, and part kitchen witchery, combining curious ingredients and techniques that seem like alchemy or dark arts to us today. Unlike the ancient Egyptians, who had fairly standardized mummification recipes, medieval embalming varied wildly, depending on region, status, and available resources. Some methods involved removing internal organs. Others focused on drying the body out using salt, ash, or lime. And some included coating the corpse in wax or resins to keep the moisture, and, unfortunately, the smell, at bay. Here's a juicy tidbit. One popular embalming technique was the use of spices not just for fragrance, but because they believed these could prevent decay. Cloves, cinnamon, myrrh, and frankincense often featured in the body-preserving spice rack. Think of it as the medieval version of Axe body spray, just on a corpse. Some bodies were packed tightly in layers of cloth, soaked with these spices and resins, then wrapped again and again, forming a barrier against moisture and bacteria. This wrapping also served a symbolic purpose, tying the body to religious rites and keeping the soul tethered. Interestingly, salt was the embalmer's best friend, acting as a desiccant to suck out moisture and halt decay. In fact, salt was so valuable for preservation that some salt mines, like the ones in Hallstatt we talked about earlier, played a key role in natural mummification by creating super dry environments underground. Historians still argue whether the goal of medieval embalming was mainly practical, slowing decay for funeral ceremonies, or spiritual, keeping the body intact for resurrection. Medieval theology often held the physical body in high regard, believing the flesh would one day reunite with the soul. So preserving the corpse was an act of hope and faith. Another quirky detail, some embalming recipes included bizarre ingredients, like powdered crocodile dung or mercury. Yes, crocodile dung, believed to have antibacterial properties, though let's be honest, it probably just made things smell worse. Mercury was a favorite in alchemical circles, prized for its supposed preservative and transformative powers. The whole embalming process was usually handled by specialists, sometimes clergy, sometimes lay people with secret family recipes passed down like precious heirlooms. Embalming was expensive and reserved for the wealthy or important, linking back to how mummification could signify social status. So, as you imagine medieval embalmers mixing their bizarre potions, remember.
Next up, we'll crack open the myths about mummy curses. Because you know you want to hear if medieval people were as paranoid as Hollywood makes them out to be. Alright, let's talk mummy curses. But hold up. You're probably expecting tales of ancient Egyptians unleashing supernatural wrath, right? Well, in the medieval world, things were a bit different. The idea of a mummy's curse, as we know it, is mostly a modern invention, born from 19th and 20th century Egyptomania. But medieval people had their own set of fears and superstitions about preserved bodies. In Europe, rather than curses, mummies were often seen through the lens of religious morality. A well-preserved body might be considered a sign of sainthood or divine favor. On the flip side, a body that decayed quickly or seemed unholy could be interpreted as evidence of sin or damnation. This wasn't just idle gossip. It shaped how communities treated the dead and even influenced burial practices. That said, some medieval texts do hint at fears surrounding disturbed graves or improperly handled remains. Imagine accidentally waking a restless soul or inviting pestilence by disrespecting a corpse. The line between spiritual punishment and physical disease was blurry, and mummies, being both dead and preserved, occupied a strange in-between. Historians still argue whether these fears were widespread or mostly localized superstitions. Unlike the Hollywood horror trope of curses triggering plagues or instant death, medieval concerns were more about spiritual unrest or social scandal than sudden supernatural doom. Here's a fun medieval quirk. In some regions, disturbing a corpse, especially a preserved one, could result in legal penalties. It's like a medieval don't mess with the dead policy, probably as much about social order as fear of curses. In fact, many medieval mummies were wrapped and hidden carefully to avoid attracting attention from grave robbers or curious locals. In a way, this secrecy helped fuel rumors and mystery around preserved bodies. So, while the mummy curse story was mostly a later exaggeration, medieval people definitely had their own unique blend of respect, fear, and superstition about mummies and preserved bodies. They were caught between faith, folklore, and a very human unease about death's finality. Next, we'll see how being mummified wasn't just a fate, but also a status symbol, because dying in style has always mattered. Medieval edition. Here's a medieval plot twist. Being mummified, or at least well preserved, wasn't just about death. It was a full-on social flex. The way your body was treated after death said a lot about who you were and what you meant to society. Spoiler, if you were a king, noble, or saint, your chances of ending up as a mummy, or something close, were way higher than Joe the peasant. Take, for example, the elaborate embalming and preservation of royal bodies. Kings and queens often underwent special treatments to keep their corpses intact, both for practical reasons, like long funeral processions, and symbolic ones. A well-preserved corpse was a powerful reminder of authority, lineage, and divine right. People literally kept the dead rulers on display
to reinforce political power. Imagine going to court and seeing your late king's embalmed hand waving like a ghostly puppet. Creepy, but effective. Even wealthy merchants and clergy sometimes paid for embalming or special burial conditions to showcase their status. The preserved body was a kind of legacy, a physical marker that you mattered enough to be remembered, not just in stories, but in flesh and bone, or what was left of it. Historians still argue whether this was mainly about vanity or sincere belief in resurrection and afterlife. Probably a cocktail of both. In some cases, preservation helped ensure a body would be recognizable on Judgment Day, an important detail in Christian theology. A quirky example: in medieval Italy, some mummies were even adorned with jewels, precious fabrics, or silver mass. Talk about bling for the dead. It wasn't just funerary fashion, it was a statement. Look at me. Even in death, I'm fabulous. But not everyone got this treatment. The poor and marginalized were often buried quickly and simply, with no chance of preservation. Sometimes bodies decomposed naturally, or were even discarded in mass graves. This disparity underscores how death rituals reflected social hierarchies, just like life. So if you thought mummification was just a weird side hobby for ancient Egyptians, think again. Medieval mummies were often VIPs in the afterlife club, preserved to send a message about power, faith, and social standing. Up next, we zoom into how religion steered this whole preservation obsession, turning faith into a preservation project.
You're sliding deeper into the medieval mind,
Where religion wasn't just a belief system, it was the ultimate life and afterlife manager. The way bodies were treated after death was heavily dictated by Christian doctrine, and this spiritual lens shaped how and why mummification or preservation happened in the first place. Medieval Christians believed in bodily resurrection, the idea that at the end of days, souls and bodies would reunite. So keeping the body intact was more than vanity. It was an act of faith, a hopeful gesture toward a second chance at life. If your body was preserved, it symbolized purity and readiness for judgment. Churches sometimes preserved bodies of saints or holy figures because they were thought to retain miraculous powers. These incorrupt bodies, mummies essentially, were displayed for the faithful to venerate. Imagine pilgrims flocking to see a body that hadn't rotted, proof that this person was close to God. The presence of such relics could legitimize a church and bring in donations. Holy power and cold hard cash, a medieval combo deal. Historians still argue whether the incorruptibility was miraculous or just natural preservation aided by environmental factors. Some bodies were embalmed, others benefited from dry, cool crypts. Either way, the religious significance was enormous, regardless of science. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval texts describe bodies exuding fragrant oils or blood, called myrrh or liquefaction, believed to be divine signs. Modern science suspects these are chemical reactions, but for medieval worshippers, these were literal miracles. Religious rituals around death were elaborate, from funeral masses to prayers over the corpse. Embalming and preservation were sometimes integrated into these rites, making the body a sacred vessel. Tampering with a corpse without church approval could be seen as sinful or even heretical. At the same time, theological debates raged about whether bodily preservation distracted from the soul's journey. Some clergy worried that too much focus on the body bordered on idolatry or vanity. Others embraced it as a testament to God's power. So, religion didn't just shape medieval mummification. It made it meaningful, weaving death care into the spiritual fabric of everyday life. Next, we'll see how these preserved bodies weren't just holy relics, but also political chess pieces in medieval power plays. You're now entering the tangled web where death, power, and politics collide, with mummies playing unexpected starring roles. In the medieval world, preserving a body wasn't just about respect or faith. It was also a strategic move in the ruthless game of authority and legacy. Take monarchs and nobles who made sure their embalmed bodies were displayed in grand funerary monuments or crypts. These preserved remains served as tangible reminders of their reign and legitimacy. Even decades after death, a mummified king's presence could reinforce loyalty or intimidate rivals.
It was like medieval brand marketing, but with dead bodies. One striking example is Richard III of England, whose skeleton was discovered under a parking lot in 2012. But during his time, efforts were made to honor and preserve his remains for political symbolism. His body's reburial ceremonies were carefully orchestrated to project power and continuity. Showing off a well-kept corpse sent a message: the dynasty endures. Historians still argue whether these displays were primarily about power projection or genuine mourning. Probably a bit of both. Grief is messy, but politics is messy too. Sometimes, rival factions even manipulated preserved bodies. There are tales of enemies desecrating corpses or hiding bodies to erase a ruler's legacy. In contrast, loyalists might keep the body close, literally under lock and key to claim spiritual authority or political advantage. Here's a medieval oddball. In some Italian city-states, mummified remains of former leaders were paraded during civic ceremonies, blending religious reverence with political theater. It was the medieval version of a legacy tour, only a bit more macabre. Mummies also featured in legal disputes. Some noble families used ancestral remains to stake claims on property or titles, arguing blood and bone carried rights beyond death. Talk about keeping your enemies close, even if they're dead. So, medieval mummies weren't just relics, they were players on the political chessboard, wielding silent power long after their hearts stopped beating. Coming up, we meet some of the most famous medieval mummies and unravel their stories. Bodies with tales as rich as any novel.
All right, now let's meet some medieval mummies who aren't just dusty legends, but real folks with stories that make Game of Thrones look like a soap opera. First up, there's St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne. His body, preserved naturally in a stone coffin in northern England, was found centuries later looking remarkably fresh. People believed this was a sign of holiness, and his incorrupt body became a major pilgrimage attraction, boosting the church's influence. His remains traveled around the country during turbulent times, basically medieval rock star status for a dead guy. Then we have the mysterious lady of the Capuchin catacombs in Palermo, Sicily, who was embalmed and dressed in fine lace and jewelry, perfectly preserved. Scholars debate whether she was a noblewoman or a nun, but her serene expression and intact hair have fascinated visitors for centuries. Her display wasn't just a burial, but a statement about piety and status. Another wild case is the bog bodies of Europe, like the medieval Tulland man's cousin, the Lindau man found in England. His body was brutally killed but preserved in a bog, and medieval stories spun him as a human sacrifice or execution victim. His death offers grim clues about justice and ritual in medieval society. Historians still argue about how intentional some of these preservations were. Were they embalmed for religious reasons, or did nature just take over? The line blurs with each new find. Here's a quirky twist. Some mummies were discovered wearing full suits of armor or holding weapons, frozen mid-ceremony. It's like they prepared for the ultimate battle afterlife. Knights who couldn't quite hang up their swords. These preserved bodies give us a peek into the medieval world's complex relationship with death, status, and spirituality. They weren't just dead. They were stories waiting to be told. Next, we'll explore how these mummies inspired medieval art and literature, turning bones into legend.
Now that you've met some of the medieval mummies in real life, let's peek into how these preserved bodies seeped into the culture, into art, literature, and those spooky stories whispered around flickering fires. Medieval artists loved to remind everyone of death's power, and mummies were perfect symbols. They showed up in paintings and sculptures as macabre reminders called memento mori, Latin for remember you must die. Skeletons and preserved corpses were depicted holding hourglasses or sais, teaching people humility and piety. It was like medieval Instagram, dark, dramatic, and heavy on the symbolism. One of the most iconic artistic themes was the Dance of Death, or Dance Macabre, where skeletons lead people of all ranks, from kings to peasants, in a dance toward the grave. Though not literally featuring mummies, these images captured the same vibe of mortality's unavoidable grip, reflecting how preserved bodies and death rituals informed medieval attitudes. In literature, preserved bodies or deathly apparitions appeared in morality tales and sermons.
Ghost stories sometimes featured incorrupt saints or cursed corpses rising from the grave. Think of early zombie myths, but with a religious twist. These tales served as warnings to live righteously, or else risk eternal unrest. Interestingly, some medieval texts describe visions of animated mummies guarding sacred places or cursed tombs, blurring lines between fact and folklore. Historians still argue how widespread such beliefs were, but these stories undeniably colored the way people viewed preserved bodies. A quirky tidbit: illuminated manuscripts sometimes included grotesque images of decomposing bodies alongside prayers, reminding monks of death's certainty during long hours of meditation. It's like medieval mindfulness, but with more skulls. The visual and literary presence of mummies and preserved corpses wasn't just morbid fascination. It reinforced social order and religious values by keeping mortality front and center. So, next time you see a spooky skeleton meme, remember, medieval culture was already there, using death's imagery to educate, scare, and inspire. Coming up, we'll dive into what modern science has uncovered by studying these medieval mummies, because bones don't lie, even centuries later.
All right, you've seen the art and heard the legends. But now it's time to let science do the talking. Modern science, that is. Thanks to advances in technology like CT scans, DNA analysis, and isotope testing, medieval mummies have been cracked open without ever unwrapping a single bandage, revealing secrets about health, diet, and disease that scribes and scholars of the time could only dream of. For instance, by studying medieval mummies, scientists have uncovered evidence of malnutrition, dental decay, and even diseases like tuberculosis and syphilis. These findings paint a vivid picture of medieval life. Far from the romanticized image of knights and feasts, it was a world where surviving childhood was a victory and sickness was a constant companion. One cool discovery? Isotope analysis of bones and teeth shows what people ate and where they lived. Some mummies reveal diets rich in grains and legumes, with occasional meat, while others reflect regional differences or trade influences. You can almost taste the medieval stew just by looking at their bones. Historians still argue about how representative these mummies are of broader medieval populations. After all, most preserved bodies come from elites or special circumstances, so they might not tell the whole story. Here's a quirky fact. Some mummies showed evidence of intentional dental work, like drilled teeth or extractions, suggesting medieval dentistry was more advanced and painful than you'd expect. No anesthesia back then, just a lot of grit. Scientific analysis also helps unravel mysterious deaths. Some medieval mummies bear injuries that hint at violence, accidents, or even ritual killings, offering a grim glimpse into social unrest or cultural practices. And the preservation methods themselves are under the microscope. Testing residues on bodies reveals the use of resins, oils, and salts, confirming some of those medieval embalming recipes we talked about earlier. It's like the mummies are whispering across centuries, telling us their stories without words. They're not just bones in a box, they're historical data, frozen in time. Next, we'll explore a heated debate. Were some medieval mummies deliberately preserved, or just lucky accidents of nature? Spoiler, the answer isn't always clear. All right, buckle up, because now we're diving into one of the juiciest debates among historians and scientists: intentional versus natural mummification in the medieval world. Was that well-preserved corpse carefully embalmed with secret recipes, or did it just get lucky by chilling in the right crypt conditions? Spoiler alert, it's often a messy mix of both, and scholars still bicker over the details. Intentional mummification involved deliberate human actions, removing organs, applying preservatives, wrapping in treated cloth designed to keep the body intact. This practice was expensive and usually reserved for elites or religious figures. The Capuchin monks' catacombs in Sicily, where bodies were intentionally dried and preserved, are prime examples. On the flip side, natural mummification happens when environmental factors do all the work. Dry air, low temperatures, and certain soil chemistries can prevent decay. The Hallstatt bodies in Austria, buried in salt-rich mines, are natural mummies, salt acting like nature's embalmer. Bogs, which we talked about, are another natural preservation hotspot. Historians still argue whether some bodies thought to be intentionally embalmed might actually be natural mummies and vice versa.
Distinguishing the two isn't always straightforward because medieval embalmers sometimes used simple methods that mimicked natural processes. A quirky point, in some cases, bodies were partially embalmed then left to dry naturally, creating hybrid preservation. Think of it as medieval DIY embalming kits, combined with Mother Nature's help. The debate gets even more tangled with incorruptibles, bodies found in a state of preservation without clear signs of embalming, often saints' remains. Were these miracles, or just lucky tomb environments? Skeptics argue the latter, but believers hold firm. Understanding whether preservation was intentional or accidental helps historians interpret social, religious, and cultural practices around death. It also shows how medieval people interacted with death's mystery, sometimes trying to control it, sometimes accepting its quirks. So this isn't just about dead bodies, it's about medieval humans wrestling with mortality, using science, faith, and a dash of hope. Next, we'll see when mummification plans went sideways, because preservation doesn't always play nice. Alright, now let's get into those moments when medieval mummification didn't exactly go as planned, or when nature had its own twisted ideas. Not every preserved body was a neat, saintly spectacle. Sometimes mummification failed spectacularly or took unexpected turns. For starters, embalming is tricky business. If the climate's too humid, or the spices were off, or the wrapping too tight, the body might decay anyway, sometimes producing a horror show rather than a holy relic. Imagine expecting a serene mummy and ending up with something that looks like it crawled out of a nightmare. No thanks. Then there were accidental mummies, bodies preserved because they got stuck in unusually dry crypts, icy caves, or salt mines. These were intentional but ended up offering historians precious insights. Some of these bodies still have hair, nails, even clothes intact, turning burial sites into impromptu museums. But sometimes, nature took preservation in odd directions. In peat bogs, bodies could turn dark as leather, their skin almost tattooed by centuries of acidic water. Others might show strange fungal growths or mineral deposits, creating natural sculptures more than preserved corpses. Historians still argue how medieval people reacted to these failed mummies. Were they scared? Did they see them as warnings, curses, or miraculous signs? Some records suggest that weirdly preserved bodies inspired both fear and reverence. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some places, people believed mummified bodies could walk or haunt the living if not properly buried, a belief that fueled vampire and revenant legends. So, when mummification went sideways, it didn't just mean decomposition, it meant storytelling gold. Also, grave robbers and souvenir hunters didn't help. Bodies were sometimes disturbed, stripped, or moved, turning preservation efforts into chaotic messes. This interference added layers of mystery and confusion for modern scientists trying to piece together history. So, failed preservation wasn't just decay. It was part of the medieval narrative about death's unpredictability and the thin line between the natural and supernatural. Next, we'll wrap up with how medieval mummies still captivate us, lingering in museums and minds today.
Here we are, at the grand finale of our journey through the odd and eerie world of medieval mummies. These preserved bodies, whether carefully embalmed or nature's lucky finds, still linger in our museums, stories, and imaginations, casting long shadows that stretch far beyond their own centuries. Medieval mummies haunt galleries and crypts worldwide, drawing visitors fascinated by the mystery and the humanity frozen in time. They're more than relics. They're storytellers, whispering secrets about faith, power, culture, and mortality. Each wrinkle, each stain on their skin, speaks volumes about the lives they once lived and the worlds they inhabited. Historians, scientists, and even artists keep debating and reinterpreting these bodies, peeling back layers of history and myth. They challenge our modern notions of death and remembrance, reminding us that preservation isn't just about bodies. It's about memory and meaning. And let's be honest, medieval mummies are kind of the original undead influencers, holding sway over centuries and captivating us with their silent charisma. From crypts in Italy to peat bogs in northern Europe, their legacy is as diverse as it is haunting. Here's a little fun fact to close. Some museums now use 3D scanning and virtual reality to let you meet these mummies without disturbing a single bone. It's like medieval history meets futuristic tech, a reminder that even ancient death can be cutting edge. So, as you lay your head down tonight, remember the medieval mummies.
silent witnesses to a world obsessed with life after death, power after the grave, and stories that refuse to die. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The shadows grow long, and the whispers of the past gently fade as you drift toward rest. The cold stone walls and silent crypts soften into the quiet hum of your room. The mysteries of medieval mummies settle into gentle dreams, no longer eerie but simply echoes of human lives, complex, fragile, and timeless. Let your breath slow, your mind wander softly through ancient halls where faith met death, and stories linger like a comforting presence. Sleep now, cradled by history's embrace, knowing that every ending is also a beginning. Sweet dreams.